being a Muslim that goes to the mosque with some regularity, you have some familiarity with the Muslim community, right? And so there's some things that statistics aren't going to be super helpful with because you just sort of know it. But what you know is just your experience, right? It's the Muslims that you happen to interact with, the Muslims that you see at the mosque, the Muslims that you see at your school or at your job or in your community. And it turns out that that isn't really representative of Muslims across the country. There's a lot of ways in which the experiences of an individual are going to be very different. So those are the things that the data can be really helpful with. So for example, I don't know how well you can see, but one of the things that the data shows is the size of the Muslim community. And we see that Muslims make up a little bit more than 1% of the population in the US. So on average, if there are about 100 people, one of them would be Muslim, a little bit more. But that's not going to be your experience living in the DMV. In this area, significantly larger numbers of Muslims, significantly larger share of the population is Muslim. But the fact is that Muslims are not evenly spread out across the country. So we see that in the Northeast specifically, there are a lot more Muslims than in, say, the Midwest, further out west, anywhere outside of California. If you go to Utah, for example, there's not a huge Muslim population in Utah. Up until a few years ago, there were states where there wasn't a single mosque. And so your experience living in the DMV about how common Muslims are, what sort of interactions you're going to have, isn't going to carry over nationally. And so that's important as you're thinking about where you're going to live. If you're, for moving, it's important if you're thinking about sort of nationally how Muslims are going to appear in politics, how Muslims are going to, what sort of influence we're going to have or not going to have, and where. The fact that we're not evenly spread out is an important thing to keep in mind. Can we scroll over to this next one? So not only is there a geographic between Northeast, Midwest, et cetera, we also see pretty big differences between urban and rural. Most Muslims live in urban areas. So again, DMV, it's in the Northeast and it's urban. So this chart here, which you probably can't see very well, what you see is about 1 out of every 5 Muslims lives in an urban area in the Northeast, compared to about 5%, 1 out of 20 for the public overall. So Muslims are much more likely to be in these areas. And then there are other places out sort of in the rural West, sort of Montana, parts of Utah, et cetera, where there just aren't very many Muslims. And so that's a pattern that's not going to be intuitive to you going through your daily life, but it's something that has a pretty big impact on the way the community as a whole operates. There are also differences in terms of income. Muslims nationally are about as likely as the public overall to have a relatively high level of income. But on the other hand, they're more likely to have lower incomes as well. So what does that mean? That means that there are definitely Muslims that are doing well, that are making money, that are doctors and engineers and all these sorts of things. But there are also lots of Muslims, especially like Muslim refugees and US-born Black American Muslims often, that are financially not as well off. And so focusing on just one or the other, you're not going to have a fuller perspective. And let me just skip the income. Let's go to this one about the regions of the world, the country, regions of the world. So another interesting fact that we know. So if you guys had to guess, what share of Muslims in the US were born in the Middle East? Half? A little more than half? Quarter? So somewhere between a half and a quarter. Anyone else take bets? High, low?
I would say lower.
You're guessing lower? How many? So let's split the difference between a half and a quarter and call it a third. Who would say it's higher than a third? Who would say it's lower than a third? Who would say it's lower than a quarter? Okay. Who's looking at my slide? So 14% is the number. So about 1 in 7 Muslims in the U.S. were born in the Middle East, specifically looking at Muslim adults. The number for younger Muslims actually is even lower because the share that are born in the U.S. goes up, turns out. We have a set of, there's some interesting demographic patterns of when people have come to the United States. When would you say, when did large-scale immigration to the U.S. for Muslims start? So give me a date range when lots of Muslims started coming to the U.S.
Maybe in the 80s?
80s. Before or after 80s?
Before.
You be quiet. Not you. So it's before 80s. Before or after 70s? So we've got some befores and some afters. So 1965. There was a set of significant changes to immigration law that allowed for large numbers of immigrants from the Middle East and from South Asia to start coming to the United States. So that was when we saw a big influx of Muslim immigrants, starting right around there, right around 65, 70. Before that, it was very difficult to get permission to come to the United States if you were not born in Europe. We had laws that basically said, immigrants, the immigrants we want are European immigrants. If you're not a European immigrant, we're not interested in you coming to this country. And as part of the civil rights of the 60s, there was this overturning of a lot of sort of domestic civil rights issues, right? So we had overturning of Jim Crow and these sorts of things. There was also overturning of some of our international rules about who was allowed to come to the US, why they would, and sort of what we would allow people to come for. And the biggest thing that came out of that was this idea that in the US, what we wanted, really, we didn't care where people were coming from as long as they were coming with skills and they were going to be able to sort of productively contribute to the society. And so you have a large number of people who are relatively, in their home countries, are relatively successful, relatively well-educated, then coming to the United States. And the upshot to that is you have a really interesting phenomenon, which is that immigrant Muslims tend to be wealthier than non-immigrant Muslims. And for any other immigrant community, like if you look in general about immigrants tend to be less wealthy. Immigrants tend to be financially, have to work to build assets and build themselves up. Whereas immigrants that are Muslim tend to be more wealthy because of the way in which our immigration system was set up. Because it was set up with this idea of we're trying to recruit the best and the brightest from all the other countries. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as a brain drain. And you see this in a lot of countries where you see people, who are successful, who are doing well, who are educated in their countries, saying, "I want to go to America. That's where I can, make the most money and be the most successful." And so that's who winds up coming to America. It's not sort of a random set of people from the country. It's not, the farmers, it's not the factory workers, it's the factory owners, it's the people who, are wealthy and successful in their own countries who are then coming to the US and bringing that intellectual capital, that knowledge to bear. Another pattern that we see among the Muslim community that's distinctive is the age distribution. So you may have heard in the public overall, there's been a lot of discussion that millennials, so who are millennials? What does that mean? Does anyone, have you heard that term before? Does anybody know what it means? Okay.
18 to 30.
More or less. So basically, sociologists, academics often group the population by age age cohorts, by like blocks of ages, right? So between this age and this age, we're going to call you this generation. Between this age and this age, we're going to call you this generation. And that has a lot to do with sort of what's going on at the time that people come of age, the time that people sort of graduate high school, at the time when people go to college, when they start going first vote in what election they first vote in. A lot of these things can have a really big impact on sort of the way you look at the world. So for example, if you were born, like many of you were, after 9/11, so after 2001, your entire outlook is based on a sort of post 9/11 security apparatus. Like that's all you've ever known. All you've ever known is if I'm going to the airport, I've got to go through security before I can get to the gate. And before 9/11, that wasn't the case. And so there's a generation, most of your generation, that was born in that time period, often referred to as Gen Z. Now, the generation before that was the millennial generation. This was the generation that came of age in an era where computers were common, an era where cell phones were becoming common, and that changed the way that they sort of saw the world, interacted with the world, interacted with information. And so often academics will sort of split things up in this way. And what you see is that, and then sort of on the other side, you see baby boomers. So folks that are in their probably late 50s to 60s now, up through late 70s. So many of the presidential candidates on the Democratic side are baby boomers. And there's some sort of demographic reasons why they're usually referred to in that way. But one of the key patterns that we've seen is that the younger generations are starting to outnumber the older generations. And so that has a lot of impacts in terms of political discourse, in terms of, say, the success of Bernie Sanders' campaign, just to sort of be specific. That campaign is successful in part because there are so many folks in this younger generation that are really excited and energized by what he's saying. And that's only possible because there are so many people in that generation. Now, the Muslim population skews even younger than the overall population. So most Muslims in the United States are under age 40. Most Muslims in the United States are actually most Muslim adults even, are between, say, 18 and 30, 35. And if you start to include Muslims under the age of 18, probably most Muslims in the United States are under the age of 30. So it's a very young population. And so that matters if we're thinking about things like mosque leadership. Who does the mosque need to be talking to? Who does the mosque need to be engaging? If most Muslims are under 30 and the entire board is over 60, then that's a disconnect between who needs to be served and who actually is making the decisions. So this is something that we can see in the data that may not be obvious if you're going to the mosque. Like in the mosque, oh, well, let's look around. Let's see who's at Jummah prayer. Let's see who's at the board meetings. Okay, well, maybe that's who all the Muslims are. Well, it's not, because we know that there's this difference. And there's some additional slides that I can go through, but I'm going to stop for now to make sure that we've got time for some conversation, some questions, and then I can refer back to my slides as it comes up.
Okay, cool. This mine? On the floor?
Yeah, yours is on the floor.
Yeah. Assalamu everyone. My name is Rafiq. I will be interviewing Besheer today.
So you want to start
Okay,
with
awesome.
your questions? You want to?
Yeah, so I'll start with my questions. He's giving you an overview of his work and what he does, and kind of how those statistics were affecting, his information in terms of how he's delivering that to the public. And so the questions that I have are more so kind of more on a personal note and trying to get into how he's thinking about his work and kind of how he's gotten to where he is and so on and so forth. So I'll just kind of jump right into the questions. The first question that I have is what led to you becoming a researcher at Pew?
What led to me becoming a researcher at Pew? It was twofold. One aspect of it was that I had an interest in understanding the Muslim community, being able to get a sense of like what's happening and where the direction of the community is at a more sort of at a broader scale than just sort of my personal interactions. So that was one part of it. The other part of it, just to be perfectly honest, was the fact that I wanted to find a career path that was going to allow me to, provide for my family, and sort of live a certain sort of lifestyle, and trying to find that in a way that wasn't just like, oh, I'm just going to go work in an investment bank or something. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to go do that. But on the other hand, I didn't want to just be like, well, I'm just going to go like study for the rest of my life, and like nobody's going to pay me to study for the rest of my life. So I had to like think seriously about, well, what if people actually have paid me to do
Right.
that also will allow me to explore these things that are of interest to me. So.
Very cool. And so you've chosen work that also relates to how you identify in terms of your religion. Mm-hmm. And so you've mentioned this, and I thought it was really interesting, which is that you cover Muslims but not Islam. Mm-hmm. Can you explain the difference for us?
Sure. Well, let me ask you all. What do you guys think the difference is? In my mind, that's an important distinction. Why?
So just to ask the question again really quick, it covers Muslims, not Islam.
If I had to take a guess, I would say Islam is perfect, Muslims are not.
That is accurate. And I think that sort of gets at a big piece of the distinction, which is that I study as a sociologist. I'm a sociologist by training. And so I study what people who identify as Muslim choose to do or not do, what people who identify as Muslim say they believe or don't believe. And so, I could talk about, the share of Muslims who pray 5 times a day, the share of Muslims who go to the mosque, the share of Muslims who believe in God. And none of those things is 100%. There are people who say, I'm Muslim and I don't know if I believe in God or not. I'm Muslim and I don't pray regularly. I'm Muslim and I haven't been to the mosque in 4 years. So that's what I study. That's different from theologically, is it okay to not pray 5 times a day? Like that's Islam, right? Like how often are you as a Muslim supposed to pray? How often as a Muslim are you supposed to go to the mosque? How often? So these are like Islam questions. How far do you have to travel before you're allowed to combine your prayers? Like these are Islam questions, and that's not what I study. I don't have any particular good insight into questions of like when are you allowed to combine your prayers and whether or not you're allowed to make wudu over your socks, or these are questions that like imams study, right? But what I could tell you is how many Muslims are praying and how many Muslims are fasting and these sorts of things. So that's the distinction between what I study, which is a sort of sociological question, and these theological questions.
That's really interesting. Which goes to say that you can tell us many different things about the behavior of Muslims. And with that being said, what are some of the things that are mostly that's cited a lot by, say, the news or journalists or what have you from your work that continues to come up over time?
I think there's 2 pieces, depending on whether you're talking about Muslim or non-Muslim audiences. For non-Muslim audiences, terrorism continues to come up. There's still a lot of questions about, do Muslims, support extremism? Do Muslims support terrorism? It's still the case that half of the public says that they think that Islam is more likely than other religions to encourage violence. And so journalists often want to talk about, well, do Muslims support terrorism? Do Muslims think that violence against civilian targets is okay? And that is something that we have data on. Data shows that Muslims are more likely to condemn violence against civilians than non-Muslims are. So that's one thread that just comes up quite frequently in my interviews. Within Muslim communities, what tends to be more of interest is the question of conversion. People joining Islam and people leaving Islam. So this is something that among Muslims there's often a lot of attention, right? And it makes a lot of sense, right? Whenever someone becomes Muslims and take their shahada, there's always a lot of, even in the mosque, there's a lot of excitement and they want to give hugs and so there's a lot of paying attention to that. What there isn't a lot of visible attention to, but people sort of are aware of and kind of nervous about, is that people also leave Islam, right? And the data shows that there are about as many people who were raised in a different religion and have become Muslim as who are raised Muslim and are now not Muslim. So those numbers are about even. So there are quite a few people who were raised Muslim and now don't identify anymore. And that's a topic that a lot of Muslims are very interested in. Well, why is that happening? How is that happening? What can we do about it? So I feel like what people are interested in varies depending on whether they're talking about Muslims or non-Muslims.
And so you have a very important role. You're helping to inform the public about Muslims in essence who we are and what we do and how we behave, and that's kind of influencing the way that they think about us. So in your experience and in your work, what has your work helped you understand about Muslims in America?
Oh, I know all the things. Okay, maybe not all the things. I think what it's helped me understand, I think really is just the difference between sort of understanding Islam or understanding Muslims from the perspective of who I see at the mosque, and understanding Islam and Muslims more broadly, and the extent to which there's a big gap between who you're going to see at the mosque and the people who identify as Muslim, who, as I said, I've interviewed people who literally have been like, I'm Muslim and I don't believe in God. And the first time I heard that, I was like, so how's that work? Because I was a little surprised, how does that in your head make sense? And I remember I had a research assistant who was transcribing interviews for me. And they transcribed one interview where the person had said that they were Muslim, they don't believe in God, and they wrote in so they did their transcription, and they wrote in this comment, they're like, this is completely unacceptable. This is not my research assistant was Muslim. This is completely unacceptable. I don't know what this is. Who are these people that you're interviewing? So it just went on this whole rant about how this is completely unacceptable. And some of this goes back to the point I was making about studying Islam versus studying Muslims. This is a reality, that people do struggle with things that are theologically core as they're trying to make sense of, what does this mean for me? How am I going to live my life? So I would say that's probably one thing that's been very helpful for me is sort of checking my own here's my experience, so this must be what everybody's thinking. Here's my experience, so this must be what everyone's doing, against sort of the realities.
Mm-hmm. So how does that work in a research setting in terms of how you do your research, from doing surveys to doing focus groups to sitting down and kind of looking at it from an objective point of view? Can you explain the process that you go through to gather information and to come up with a particular study?
Sure. So there's a lot of different pieces to that. I think one thing that's probably one piece of that that's probably worthwhile for you all to be familiar with more broadly is how sort of survey sampling works. So, this is something that I use a lot in my work, but it's also something you're going to hear in the news. They say, in a recent such and such poll, 47% of people say this. And, in a recent such head-to-head poll, people were more likely to support Bernie Sanders than Donald Trump, were more likely to support Biden than Sanders, more likely. So a big piece of my work is those sorts of things, not with those questions, but those sorts of things of designing a poll so that I can report back 47% of Muslims say that they go to the mosque regularly, or 42% of Muslims say that they pray 5 times a day. So how do you get to that when I didn't talk to 42% of Muslims? And in those interviews, when they're talking about, X% of voters, they didn't talk to half of the voters. They didn't talk to all the voters in the state of Michigan. So how do you get from a relatively small group of people to a broad conclusion? And a lot of that has to do with what we call random sampling. So there's some statistical techniques that you can do that basically says that if you have a sample that's representative, so if you're not just, I'm going to go to the mosque and interview 50 people, and so now I know what all the Muslims think. So if you have a way that you can interview everyone, equally likely, whether they're going to the mosque or not, whether they're old or young, whether they're rich or poor, then you only need a relatively small group in order to be representative of the whole. The best analogy that I think of is if you're cooking. Let's say you're making like a pot of soup or something, right? You want to know, like, is there enough salt in the soup, right? If you make sure that the bowl is that the pot is stirred properly, you can just taste a spoon of the soup and be like, okay, now I know there's enough salt in all of the soup because the pot's been stirred properly. You don't have to like drink all the soup and be like, all right, yep, that was enough salt. You just need a little taste. And by the same token, there are statistical mechanisms that you can use so that you can do a survey like that. So you only need a small sample, and you can represent the whole population, as long as it's properly sampled, as long as you sort of stir the sample in the same way that you would with the soup. And so one of the key things that I do is making sure that our methodologies are robust in those ways, so that we can do an interview of 1,000 Muslims, 500 Muslims, 1,500 Muslims, and then say, now this actually represents the Muslim community. Rather than, well, I talked to 1,000 Muslims. I could talk to 1,000 Muslims at Eid, and I would get a certain perspective, but that's not going to be representative. So it's not just how many, it's how these people were selected. And that's something that's important in my work, but it's also just important as you think about surveys more broadly.
So what are these studies indicating about Muslims in America in regards to going forward into the future, in terms of like the millennial generation, generations that are, getting much older? What can we, are there any particular indications or themes that are coming about?
I'll give you one, and then I want to see what you guys get some questions from you guys as well. So one pattern that we see very strongly is that the size of the Muslim population is growing in the United States. Our current estimates are Muslims make up a little bit more than 1% of the population, maybe about 4 million Muslims in the country overall. But we see those numbers increasing. And we see those numbers increasing because immigration continues to happen. We see that as those numbers increasing because, as I mentioned, Muslims tend to be a younger population, which means that they're still having children, and we assume that like some significant share of those children are going to be raised Muslim. So for a number of reasons, we see the number of Muslims in the United States is likely to continue to grow. It's been growing over the last 20 years pretty quickly, and we expect it, even if you go further back, about 40 or 50 years, pretty quickly, and we expect that it'll continue to grow at a pretty quick rate.
Did you have a question for them in particular? Or?
No, I want them to.
Okay.
I want to know if they have a question for me.
Okay. Yeah.
So going back to the data where some Muslims are leaving Islam, is there a specific demographic, or is it scattered around?
It's pretty scattered. U.S.-born, foreign-born. I think to the extent that there's one group that stands out as having been raised Muslim and isn't anymore, is probably Iranian Muslims. And those of you that are familiar with the history, that won't be a surprise, because many of the people, the Iranians that came to the United States, precisely because they were not interested in living in a theocracy. Like, that's a big reason why people left Iran and came to the U.S. Because before 75 or so, there was a secular state in power in Iran that the U.S. supported. And then that group, that state was overthrown, was removed, and since then it's been an Islamic republic, and lots of folks were like not interested in that. They weren't interested in the way in which Iran was going to be governed, and so they left. And so it's not a random sample of Iranians that came to the U.S. It was these people who really weren't happy with living in that sort of situation. And many of them have been turned off from Islam completely. Like, oh, well, if that's Islam, I don't want anything to do with it. So that's one demographic that stands out. But it's pretty broad, the pattern. Other questions?
Can you make sure your own biases are getting involved in your, stat and whatever your questions you're asking?
I don't have any biases.
You don't have any biases.
How could you ask such a question?
Biased by your
Yeah, I'm insulted. No. I think that there are a couple reasons, a couple ways in which we deal with that. The biggest one, probably the easiest one to explain, is the fact that none of our work is done individually. Everything is collaborative in my organization. So I'll be the lead researcher on something, but there are going to be probably 5 other people that are involved in working on the project. And so if I'm doing something, unconsciously, like I'm not realizing, I'm not thinking of it this way or that way, it's almost certain that one of those people would be like, well, why are we doing this? Why are we asking it this way? Did you think about this? And that is a good check to be like, oh, wait, no, I didn't even think of that. That's a good point. People may read this way, or people may think of this way. So that's a big thing we do, is everything's very collaborative internally. And also we have teams of outside experts, outside advisors, that will also review our work to help us make sure, like, oh, well, why are you asking it this way? Why don't you do this? Why are you not asking this question? So that's mainly how we deal with that.
I'm going to jump in with another question. What is, to you, the value of statistics? And on top of that, what is the value of think tanks?
The value of statistics. The value of statistics in general, I think, is it lets you have a broader perspective than your personal interactions. So, there's a value in just knowing things from personal interactions, but being able to go beyond that, and have a sense not just of all the people I've talked to, but people that, for one reason or another, I'm not likely to encounter in my day-to-day life. How are they experiencing things? How are they? I think that's valuable. I think that's especially valuable in this day and age where increasingly people live in kind of echo chambers. People live surrounded by other people that are like them in all sorts of ways. So we see this. I go back to this. This isn't sort of my focus, but I go back to politics because it's something that a lot of folks are going to be familiar with. You'll hear, if you're in an area that's heavily Democratic, for example, you'll hear lots of people that are like, I don't know anyone who voted for President Trump. I can't imagine how anyone would vote for President Trump. Nobody supports President Trump. The statistics show us that that's factually inaccurate. And the election showed us that that's factually inaccurate. In fact, a lot of people support President Trump. And so if you don't know anyone who supports Trump, that just means that you don't have a good representative of the nation. Not that nobody supports him, because we have the data in the election results. Forget about statistics. Statistics are valuable in giving us the predictions. But we even have the data in the election results saying, guess what? Lots of people do support Trump. And so statistics help you get beyond, well, in my experience, in my circle, this is what it looks like. So that must be what it looks like for everyone. To really understand, well, what does it look like for everyone? Well, it turns out this is, and so, for politics, that's important. For religion, that's important. If you're sort of thinking about mosque governance, that's important. So those are the things I think the statistics are helpful with.
And then the other question behind that was the value of think tanks in a more broader sense.
Think tanks are valuable because at their best, so think tanks, as with any sort of group of organizations, they're going to have your good and your bad and your sort of in the middle, right? But at their best, think tanks are valuable because they can give unbiased facts about issues. Like, if you're a politician, in a certain sense, it's your job to spin things to fit your narrative. Like, that's really like what you're there for. You're not there to like vet facts. That's not even your training. You're not trained as sort of a statistician or a sociologist, or you're trained to know how to get people on board with a vision that you see for the future, right? That's your job as a politician. And that's a perfectly fine and valuable and valid job. But that's very different from understanding the facts on the ground. And so think tanks at their best are valuable because they can help you understand those facts on the ground. And once you understand those facts, you can then use it as springboard and be like, and so that's why I want to do this, or that's why I want to do this. But if you don't start with an understanding of what the situation is, it's very hard to accurately decide where you need to go next. So.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So like policymakers are using this information to make policy that's going to affect people's lives in a day-to-day sense, what have you. Any other questions from the audience? You guys have any things that you were thinking about or that you were curious about in terms of his work or anything outside of it maybe?
Question related to Pew Research. Is it nonprofit or is it a corporation?
It's a nonprofit. So the way that the Pew Research Center is a little bit of a, even among think tanks, is a little bit unusual because we have basically our own money. Usually a lot of think tanks have to go through the exercise of getting someone to fund their research. And we don't. We have a large endowment from the Pew family. Pew's actually a family name. And so the Pew family, decades ago, set aside millions and millions of dollars to do research on a variety of topics because they felt like they wanted to see a certain type of unbiased research out there. And so they put all this money into like a trust, but like they put all this money aside and said like, okay, here's a bunch of money, go do research. And like, they don't actually have any say on like what the research is. Like, nobody from the Pew family works at our company. Nobody from the Pew family like reviews our reports before we put them out. But they sort of decided that they felt like having this sort of trusted, unbiased research in a variety of areas was something that they wanted to put their money onto. The same way, Bloomberg decided he wanted to put his money on running for president. So he's going to spend $500 million on trying to run for president. The Pew family said they're going to put their money on trying to get this sort of data out there. And so they put a bunch of money into that. And so that puts the Pew Research Center into a really great position where we don't have to go running around like trying to fundraise to do a project because we've got the funds kind of sitting there. Question? Why not?
How back does your research go to? Is it just Muslim immigrants, or do you guys do enslaved Muslims?
So most of our work is depending on how you count it, it goes back to either 2007. Our research on Muslims goes back to either 2007 or 2001. So that's about as far back as Pew's data goes. That's as far back as we've been trying to collect this sort of survey data. The historical research on, but that's not, to be clarified, that's not necessarily that we just study immigrants. There's also a sizable US-born Muslim population that we study. In our latest study, that was about 42% of Muslim adults were born in the country. So they're part of the group that we study. But the historical questions about, enslaved Africans that came over, or some of the proto-Islamic movements of the early 20th century, that's not work that we do. There are academics that do really good work on that. And one of the things that that the Pew Research Center tends to do is it tends to look for what we call orphan topics, topics where there isn't already a lot of folks doing this research. And academics are doing a great job looking at this sort of historical stuff. There's no reason for us to jump into that. But academics don't generally have the millions of dollars it takes to do a national study of Muslims, so that's where we're like, okay, well, that's a contribution that we can give.
I have a question. I think you mentioned about you got into the job because you like research, but how did you get into sociology? Is that something you always knew you wanted to do?
Oh God, no. My undergraduate degree was in engineering. And I spent 4 years working, doing business consulting. So no, sociology was very much not what I thought I was going to do. If you had asked me at 16 or at 22, sociology wouldn't have been on my radar. So how did I wind up doing sociology? Because I decided at some point that what I wanted to do is I wanted to study Muslims. I wanted to understand how Muslims are doing things, why Muslims are doing things. I sort of looked around at my community and was kind of scratching my head, I don't understand what's going on here. And I sort of bounced around disciplines trying to get a feel for what disciplines would have the tools that would help me make sense of communities. I spent some time I did a master's in Middle East studies, sort of studying history and those sorts of tools. And I felt like sociology was a really good toolbox. It had statistical training. It had sort of knowledge about how to explore populations, demography. So it just had a good sort of technical and theoretical framework, I thought, for understanding communities. And so I felt like, well, I could take those tools and apply them to the Muslim community, which at the time nobody was really doing much of. So that was kind of how I landed with sociology.
Do you know how many percent Muslims are actually paying zakat every year?
I do not know how many are paying zakat. Not all of them. No, I don't know that. And we ask questions about religious practice in a variety of ways. We don't ask about zakat. Can you guess why we might not ask zakat on a survey like this? Exactly. Pretty much if I ask about daily prayer, that's the thing. You say you're Muslim, this is a thing you're supposed to be doing, right? It's a pretty straightforward A to B thing. We start asking about zakat, and it gets really messy, right? So this person didn't pay zakat. Why not? Did they have the required amount of assets or not? Well, we don't know. We didn't ask about assets. That's a whole other set of questions. So zakat is one of these things where asking if you've paid it is difficult. Not because asking is difficult, because making sense of what a yes or a no means. And if someone says, yes, I paid zakat, and they mean I gave $20 at the masjid, but I'm a millionaire. But they say yes. So even a yes or a no wouldn't help you, right? You want to know well, how much did you pay? Where did you pay? So there's so much you'd have to unpack to really make sense of that. I mean, I did some work for Islamic Relief at one point. Obviously they're interested in this exact question of paying zakat, who's paying, how much are they paying? And there, one thing that we did explore wasn't whether or not you're paying zakat or how much you're paying, but whether or not any of your zakat was going to this organization. And that's sort of a much more straightforward kind of question that we can just ask. Are you interested in giving zakat to X or Y or Z? Do you think this is an organization worthy of your zakat? But that's a different question. That's not a theological question, of whether you're paying your zakat or how much. So it's just sort of a hard thing to explore.
Do you have some more statistics from South Asian group?
Yes. Do you have specific ones you want to know about?
Well,
Yes, we have all the statistics. I have a whole book of statistics right here. You can take a copy with you. No, seriously, please take a copy with you. But no, We do have some analyses about subgroups. Not you. You can't have one. We do have some analyses of subgroups, of South Asian subgroups, in terms of sort of the immigrant U.S.-born split, in terms of the economics. Economically, they tend to be more well off than some other. Like I showed, immigrants overall tend to be really well off. South Asian immigrants tend to be relatively better off than some other immigrant groups. I'm trying to think of what are some other interesting patterns we've seen among South Asians. I'd have to go back and look, but yeah, we've sort of unpacked some of the differences by subgroup.
How about marriage, just in general,
Muslims want to get married. What do we know about marriage? Well, we had this really interesting question. Let me see if I can pull it up quickly. It's on actually, you know what? It's on my slides. So I've got a copy of that on my phone. Don't worry about it. So we asked a question about what things are an essential part of what being Muslim means. And getting married was one of the things we asked about. And about half of Muslims feel like getting married is an essential part of what being Muslim means to them, which puts it about on par with dressing modestly or eating halal food. In terms of like the essentials. Dressing modestly, eating halal food, getting married are all kind of at the same, about half-ish number, which is much lower than like, believing in God, loving the Prophet, following the Quran and Sunnah. But it's a significant number that think marriage is like a really kind of important part of their religion, that it's sort of half of their faith. So we definitely have seen that. And as you might expect, there are interesting demographic differences between married and unmarried Muslims on a variety of things. Other questions?
Do you look at like the health of the Muslim population?
Like physical health?
Yeah, like diseases, illnesses that affect them.
Not really. And I think, not really. And one reason why is because a lot of the things that affect them, sort of health things that affect Muslims, are really ethnic. There are things that tend to affect Arabs. There are things that tend to affect South Asians. There are things that tend to affect Turks. There's sort of things that tend to affect Africans. And those things are all covered very well by like the CDC, the NIH. So there's a lot of medical research on demographic differences, and we know that Africans are much more likely to get sickle cell. So there's a lot of data on those sorts of things. And my sense is that a lot of the things that we see among Muslims are really just sort of special cases of these broader demographic patterns. There's not a whole lot of reason to think that there'd be massive health disparities just by religion that sort of wasn't linked to other sort of ethnic factors.
I have a question for you. What is something about your work that many people would find surprising, or that is not maybe common misconceptions about the work that you do?
Again, I think there's a sort of Muslims and there's a non-Muslims answer to that question. I think the Muslims answer to that question is probably that there's only about 4 million Muslims in the U.S. The Muslims only make up about 1% of the population. And I think that's because whenever I'm talking to Muslims, I'm talking to them in a place where there are lots of Muslims. And so they're always like, but that's not my experience. And so it's often very surprising when I'm like, well, here's the number. And they're like, well, that's not my experience. Your data has to be wrong. And I have to walk through, well, here's why your experience isn't representative of everyone. So I'd say for Muslims, that's probably the most common thing. For non-Muslims, it's probably the terrorism question again, the fact that the Muslims are more likely to condemn violence against civilians than non-Muslims. And arguably, it's kind of sad that that's so surprising, but like that's something that often is surprising.
So we had a conversation prior to this interview, and you're speaking about how as Muslims, we're very communal, and so like our reality or like our perception about Islam is largely dictated upon our environment and people that we spend time with. And you were mentioning like how like in Utah, maybe there's not a lot of Muslims as compared to like an urban area like DC. And so there, when it comes to community, it seems like that is an integral part about also being Muslim. And then, but what was interesting to me as well is that you said that some people may identify as Muslim, but they may not actually be practicing, say, the day-to-day things. And so I'm just curious about like, have you found like maybe small populations out in areas where there's not a lot of Muslims that are still, say, practicing Islam in a traditional sense?
I mean, it certainly is present. It's not a topic that I've spent a lot of time researching. I mean, we certainly know that there are. It's now the case that there are mosques in every state in the nation.
Who has the most?
Probably New Jersey, maybe New York, if I had to guess. But I mean, I don't know for sure, but that would be my guess.
New York has a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah, I know that because I used to live there. But yeah.
yeah, I think.
Which state didn't have any? Which state didn't have any?
I'd have to look it up.
So you know where not to go?
Now they all do, but I mean, I'd have to look.
Alaska probably the last one.
Maybe Alaska. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look at Professor Bagby's 2010. There was a study about 10 years ago of mosques internationally, and I know that I was involved in the board that was doing the 2020, and I remember as we read through, they were like, well, when we did this before, there weren't mosques in a couple states. And was it time to pray? Oh.
Okay. Well, let's give this brother a round of applause for his talk.